Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our podcast today of the future of vascular health. My guest again today is Dr. Hans Vink, my partner for many years, and today we're going to continue our discussion on kidney health. And so last week, we had a wonderful conversation with Annalyn Scott and her husband, Raymond, and they basically talked about the 27-year journey that he's had with all the ups and downs that he's had with kidney health. And part of that is he talked about, having a transplant, going on dialysis at a clinic, and then going on home dialysis. He also talked about the challenges that he had with cardiovascular risk increase that prevented him from having a transplant. And then he also talked about 2 bouts with sepsis. So today, what we're going to discuss is kidney disease and the implications for cardiovascular risk. And then we'll also talk a little bit about why the risk factor for sepsis also increases in these kidney patients. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hans and let him share what we've prepared for today. So Hans, take it away.
Well, thank you, Bob. Like you said, 2 weeks ago, we already discussed kidney disease and how glycocalyx is involved and how damage of glycocalyx can impair kidney function and contribute to loss of filtration function and the different stages of kidney failure. What I want to do today is that for a person with a failing kidney, a kidney disease patient, how that affects your total risk of cardiovascular disease. So we know that people with kidney disease have a much higher risk of getting a heart attack or a stroke or cardiovascular-related death. And today I want to go into a little bit more detail what kind of risk factors might cause that and how potential glycocalyx is involved in that kidney disease related increase of cardiovascular risk.
Great. I'm looking forward to seeing what you've prepared.
So just a little summary of where we ended 2 weeks ago. This slide shows for different colors the level of risk for cardiovascular complications with kidney disease. So from top to bottom, it shows you the different stages of kidney failure. So level 1 with a relatively normal level of filtration, more than 90 milliliters per minute, and then progressing to less and less filtration down to kidney failure when your filtration levels are really, really low, below 15 milliliters per minute. And then from left to right are the different levels of albumin leakage, protein leakage into the urine. Like we also discussed 2 weeks ago that part of the filtration unit in the kidney, part of those glomeruli filtration units is glycocalyx, covering those big holes in the endothelium through which all the water in the plasma is filtered. And as soon as glycocalyx breaks down, then not only the fluid and water will be filtered, but you start losing a lot of proteins, plasma proteins like albumin, from the kidney into the urine. And that's also measured as a risk factor, as a sign of increased cardiovascular risk, because if that starts happening in the kidney, it probably also means that your glycocalyx and your endothelial function in the rest of your body is also compromised. So that's why even at a relatively normal level of kidney filtration, if you start increasing from left to right your concentration of albumin in the urine, then still at a low level of kidney failure, you can still have a high risk of cardiovascular disease. And then non-surprising, at the different stages, if you are at high level of albumin leakage and you start losing more kidney function, then your cardiovascular risk increases even further.
As I look at this, I still am struck every time I look at this chart. You look at stage 3, you have 2 levels, A and B.
Yes.
And generally, most of these patients aren't even on the radar yet of their health practitioners because this is just silently happening. And if you already look at the high level of risk that's increased for these patients, it's really shocking.
It is shocking, and like you said, people don't notice. You don't really have symptoms. But I think even last week, when Annalyn and Raymond were talking with you, I think even in that discussion, Annalyn mentioned that, even if you have a low filtration rate of about 60-ish mils per minute, sometimes people don't realize that's serious. They don't. There's no follow-up, and
Right.
it's okay. You're aging and your filtration levels go down, but this really shows you that you're at moderate to mild risk. No, but your risk of cardiovascular disease, especially if you start losing a little bit of albumin, can be very, very high. So it's something to take really, really serious.
Yeah. Well, thanks for showing us again.
Yeah, so given the fact that this is so much an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, I also put another slide in on the incidence of end-stage kidney disease. So how many more new patients um, are there per year with end-stage kidney disease? And I split it up in different countries just to get some sense. So this slide shows for all the different countries from left to right, and the US is here on the left, how many more new end-stage kidney disease patients are added per million people in the population. So this shows that the US is one of the winners, if you might call it
So
that.
you'd say if we were in the Olympics, we either got a gold or silver medal in a sport we don't want to win.
No, and you're absolutely right, Bob. So I didn't realize that there was such a big difference between different countries, and that the US was doing really, really badly. One of the winners, as you might call it, adding 300 to 400 new end-stage kidney patients per million people in the population. So if you multiply that with 350, that's a lot of new kidney patients per year. And just for fun, because I'm Dutch, my girlfriend is from Brazil, just to show the difference. And to be honest, I don't really know why there's such a big difference um, between these countries and the US. One thing that might contribute, if I think about it, a lot of the kidney failure is a consequence of obesity and diabetes. So I think the levels of obesity and diabetes might be a bit higher in the US compared to Netherlands and Brazil, for instance.
Yeah. So these are startling statistics, just like what we talked about on our first week when I went through all the statistics and showed what the statistics are and what the economic cost is, and let alone the lack of productivity, and you know it's a terrible disease.
Well, and it also shows you why a few years back it was only 1 in 9 people having kidney issues, and that changed into 1 in 7 or something. Huh, Bob?
Yeah. So 10 years ago when I first started talking about this, it was 1 in 9. Now it's 1 in 7. So this bears out those
Yep.
statistics. So that's going to be scary what it'd be in another 10 years if we don't get this yield curve under control.
Well, and then the next slide shows how big the impact is of having end-stage kidney disease, how much increased risk you'll have to get cardiovascular complications. So this is a little bit of a complicated slide. Let's focus on the lower curves first. So the lower curves are for the general population, so without kidney disease. And it shows you for different ages, starting at the left at the 25-year-olds, going all the way up to people older than 85, what the annual mortality is. So pretend the percentage of these people getting cardiovascular complications and dying from cardiovascular disease. So this is a logarithmic scale. So each step is a tenfold increase. And it shows you, if you compare the 25-year-olds with the 85-year-olds, there's about a 500 to 1,000 increased risk of dying from cardiovascular disease when you get older, which makes sense.
Yeah.
So not surprising. And then within that population of the general population, you see little 4 different lines. It's just looking at differences between males and females and white and colored people. So the little squares on the bottom are for females. So females have a relatively lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease than males. The circles are for white people, no, males and females combined. Then the little diamond shapes are the males. And then the triangles, which are a little bit higher than the males, are for people with color. So there's a little bit difference between males, females, and white or colored, but still there's this very clear age dependency. So at a young age, you're safe. When you get older, obviously there's more risk.
So
But
it's interesting as you describe this graph, and if you think back to that other one and go by country, the U.S. is a pretty diverse population of males, females, people of color and white, and yet we're still the highest. But then if you compare it to even countries where the higher population levels might be of color, for example, we still have a almost double or triple risk.
yeah, triple. Yeah, so there's something else other than just gender or ethnic background that
Right,
adds to that risk in the US.
right.
Um, But what I found striking, if you look at the top curves, so the same four groups, they're all superimposed pretty much. And these are people on dialysis with end-stage kidney disease. So that shows there is an age dependency, but if you compare the young people of 25-year-old on dialysis with same age people from the general population. So the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease increased by 500 to 1,000-fold, having kidney disease for that young age group. So these young people on dialysis are actually the same risk of dying as 85-year-olds in the general population.
Whew, that's crazy.
So that's huge. So
So
yeah,
if you take somebody and they develop, go on dialysis, for example, let's say 65, they have their, I mean, they have a really short life expectancy.
yeah. So if you're like you're 65, you say,
Yeah,
like here, if they so they have a relative risk of less than one, if of a mortality percentage of less than one. So if you compare that with people on dialysis, there's more than like a 10-fold increase in risk. Just
yeah,
going on dialysis being 65 years of age.
right. And I think that's the amazing thing last week as I talked to Raymond and Annalyn. That's what's so shocking about Raymond is the 27-year journey. But, as he said, he thinks by being able to have us help him with his uh, vascular system, not only did it keep him alive, but it made it possible for him to repair his vascular system enough that he just got another kidney transplant. So,
Well, and it makes perfect sense. If you on the next slide, I'll show you what the risk factors are that are specific for these kidney patients on top of traditional risk factors, and how
yeah.
that also changed with Raymond. Because now you mentioned, I remind what he was saying. This slide shows all the risk factors that contribute to increased cardiovascular risk that kidney patients might be exposed to. So I mean, two subgroups, like traditional risk factors and the non-traditional risk factors are more specific for the kidney patients. So many of the people with kidney disease also have hypertension. And we talked about hypertension before, that small increases in blood pressure already contribute significantly to your cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, we
Uh,
talked about that last month for
yeah, we
people if
did,
they
huh?
want to go back and watch those videos.
Many of the kidney patients were diabetics before that causing their kidney disease. So, that's another risk factor that by itself also adds to the cardiovascular risk. Smoking, obviously, is
Yeah.
a big risk factor. And many people with kidney disease also have uh, uncontrolled lipidemia. A lot of the lipid factors in blood are different than in the general population. So these are all
So just
known
for
risk
the
factors.
people in our audience that may not know what that last thing is, could you just describe that a little better?
Well, the dyslipidemia, so lipids are, for instance, the triglycerides that
Okay.
you can measure in the blood. So the, people with kidney disease generally have very high triglycerides levels, and that might by itself is a risk factor that can cause cardiovascular complications. Well, in addition to these traditional risk factors that we understand how they relate to cardiovascular risk, people with kidney disease also have non-traditional risk factors, and the two most important ones are they generally have much stiffer blood vessels or vascular calcification. It almost looks like their vascular system is aging much faster than people without kidney disease. And I think that's also one of the things that Raymond talked about, that because of his stiffer vessels, that for a long time he wasn't eligible for a kidney transplant, for instance.
Yeah, that's, he talked a lot about that. And so basically that was basically saying, hey, all you have to look forward to is home dialysis, and then you're already beating the odds. So he already pretty much knew he had a death sentence. He just didn't know when the Grim
Yeah.
Reaper was going to call.
So that's a well-known increased risk for kidney patients. The thing is, we don't really understand why their vessels get so much faster, stiffer, and when their aging process of the vascular system is so much accelerated. And the reason that those stiffer vessels contribute to your cardiovascular risk, there's several reasons. One of them is that if you have stiffer vessels, stiffer arteries, then it's much harder for the heart to pump blood into your vascular system, and that causes heart failure at some point. Also, combined with that poor kidney function that causes that your vascular system is overfilled because you cannot produce urine, so there's too much water accumulating in your vascular system that also overloads the heart, literally causing heart failure. So that accelerated aging in these kidney patients might, cause heart failure and thereby cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, so the hopeful thing that came out of our discussion last week with Raymond was they talked about, he was rejected. He's told he could never have a transplant because of what you're describing right here. Not only did he have calcification and stiffness, he had blockages. And so that they wouldn't give him a kidney because it probably wouldn't succeed because of the risk. He probably couldn't even have survived the surgery in reality. But the crazy thing is once we started working with him, um, after a couple of years, he was able to get back on the transplant list. And then when he got examined and they compared his old results to what the results are, what they looked at, they go, this isn't even the same person. So to me, next week we're going to talk about how does that happen and why could that happen and what effect does the nutraceuticals we've created have in making that possible. So I think that'll be exciting talk
Yes,
next week that we'll go over.
and I will show a little bit of that also in these next few slides, Bob, because that ill understood aging process of the vasculature, we know from another study that we did on aging,
Right.
that breakdown of your glycocalyx, but aging is a central part of that stiffness of the vasculature. And if you can prepare your glycocalyx or slow down the breakdown of your glycocalyx with aging, you also can normalize the elasticity of your larger vessels. And hopefully that will also help kidney patients, in reducing that stiffness of their blood vessels and thereby reducing their risk of cardiovascular complications.
Yeah.
Uh,
So the next one you're going to talk about is the inflammation or sepsis. And, that sepsis is a scary thing. And, I literally lived through it twice with Raymond and Annalyn and knew how dangerous that was for him.
yeah, and same there. So for the increased risk of inflammation, I want to show some data in the next few slides, how increased toxins in the blood of a kidney patients because they don't filter as much and there's a lot of waste circulating in the blood, by breaking down your glycocalyx, how that might add to that increased level of inflammation and risk for sepsis.
So what you're saying is the blood isn't, the kidneys can't do its proper function, so it's not able to cleanse, or there's a lot of toxins in the blood as a result that also increase the risk. So that's what you're going to show us next.
Yeah, so my line, obviously biased perspective is if that happens, if the kidney doesn't filter properly, there's more toxins circulating in the blood, that by breaking down glycocalyx, that might be the path by which in kidney patients your large vessels become more stiff, and at the same time your inflammation increases and you're much higher risk of sepsis-related complications.
And so that explains again through the years as we've tested lots of patients with the glycocheck, oftentimes as we measure the systemic health of the glycocalyx, which is part of what we measure with the microvascular health score, when people have a bad or not a very thick glycocalyx, so they have a high perfused boundary region, we find that those patients, we alert them, and then they go find out with more information about their health. And quite often they find already that they're in stage 3 or 4 of kidney disease and they didn't even know it.
Correct. So if I move on to some of the experimental data, so one way that we haven't discussed in the last few weeks yet to measure breakdown of your glycocalyx is with what we call an atomic force microscope. That's a very, very sensitive device to measure small levels of breakdown quantitatively of your glycocalyx. So the way this device works, it's a big microscope, but instead of an optical lens, it doesn't look at the glycocalyx. It uses a little spring on the tip of the objective. So if this is the little spring, and you can measure the position of that spring with a laser. If that spring is above your endothelial cells with the glycocalyx, there's very little force pressing against that spring. So, and if you start moving that spring closer to the glycocalyx, so moving it from left to right is actually moving it closer to your glycocalyx, you can measure the force that you need to move that spring down. And as soon as it starts touching glycocalyx and you try to push it even further into glycocalyx, you will need increased force to push it down into glycocalyx. So that's what happened here in the middle. So, you go down, you touch the glycocalyx, and then you will start bending that spring because you try to push it down against the resistance. And at some point, you will push it all the way through glycocalyx, and then that spring will touch the endothelial cells, and then it's even more difficult to push it deeper because endothelial cells are a little bit more stiffer than glycocalyx. So if you measure the force that you need to push down that spring, so first on the vertical axis is the force. So first the force is very low. If there's nothing keeping the spring from going down, you don't need a lot of force to lower that spring. As soon as that spring touches glycocalyx and you want to push it even further down, see that the force increases that you need to push it into glycocalyx. And at some point when you are all the way through glycocalyx, you touch your endothelial cells. If you want to push it even into the endothelial cell, you have to push it even harder to get it into the endothelial cell. So this part, going from touching the glycocalyx to all the way through the bottom of glycocalyx close to the endothelium. So this is then the force that you need to push it all the way through. So by measuring the force, and you see when the force changes from very little to significant force, and then at some point you touch your endothelium, you can use that range of motion of the spring as a measure for your glycocalyx dimension.
Yeah, so I remember when we were doing these experiments with this group in Germany 4 or 5 years ago, and it was really valuable to us because that also validated, as you could measure that little red line there, we were able to correlate that also to the measurements we had potentially with the glyco check and the PBR measurement, which further validated the accuracy of what we were measuring systemically.
Yeah, clearly. So I'll show some of the data in a few more slides, Bob, how these measurements of damage to your glycocalyx by some solutions or blood samples that you take from a patient and expose the glycocalyx to those blood samples, how that correlates with systemic measurement with a glycocheck device.
Great. I think that'll be of great interest to our audience.
So if you measure this way the thickness of your glycocalyx, and you can see, for instance, what the impact is on glycocalyx dimension when you put some enzymes in the fluid that you expose the glycocalyx to. So one of those enzymes, for instance, is heparinase. So before heparinase, you see many different measurements in many different endothelial cells. You have a certain thickness of your glycocalyx. Then if you add some enzyme or toxins in that fluid that is on top of your glycocalyx in those culture dishes, then you have a significant loss in dimension of your glycocalyx. So not surprisingly, heparinase, which breaks down the heparin sulfate glycosaminoglycans of glycocalyx, that breaks it down, your glycocalyx is damaged and the dimension is significantly reduced.
So
yeah,
could
go
you
ahead,
just describe, so that's an enzyme that's is not you find in the blood, correct?
Yeah, so this is not just an artificial enzyme. There's also an enzyme that is produced by your own body during, for instance, inflammation. So
Right.
many patients with inflammation also have increased circulating levels of heparinase that contributes to the breakdown of your glycocalyx and contributes to the inflammatory response.
Right. So I just want our audience to remember, if they join us next week, we'll be talking more about that and the mechanism of action of how we believe we repair the glycocalyx to prevent this from happening.
So similarly, instead of taking heparinase in another experiment, the group in Münster also took blood samples from kidney patients. And then
This
again,
to me is like amazing that we were able to do this and show this.
yeah, they're really very nice experiments. So they took blood samples from a kidney patient, spin it down, take the red blood cells out, so you have a fluid from a kidney patient with normal blood plasma plus the toxins that are circulating in your body because of your kidney that doesn't function as well. So when they use the blood plasma from a kidney patient instead of the enzyme, get a very similar response. So this again is control experiments with blood plasma from healthy controls. But if you take a blood sample from a kidney patient, you have a very significant drop in your glycocalyx dimensions on these cultured endothelial cells in a culture dish as measured with your atomic force microscope. So
So
something
this second thing on the slide here, or the second image, or the middle, over in the middle of there,
this one here.
yeah, that one. That's really what we're seeing with a lot of the people. They say 1 in 3 people have elements of this and they don't even know it.
Yeah, so even without knowing what kind of toxins are circulating in the blood of a kidney patient,
Yeah.
something's in there that really, really is damaging to your glycocalyx.
Yeah.
Well, I'll continue on these kinds of experiments in a little bit. Now I want to switch a little bit to the role of glycocalyx, potential role of glycocalyx breakdown in the accelerated aging of the larger blood vessels in general, and which also might be relevant for the kidney patients. So I know I've showed this once before, but I think I want to revisit just to discuss again how glycocalyx breakdown might contribute to that increased vascular stiffness and increased accelerated aging also in kidney patients. So this is some experiments that we did in a mouse model of aging. And then, so the gray bars are young mice, the blue bars are old mice. And this shows that with aging is associated with a decreased dimension of your glycocalyx. Then also to give a little hint yet that what we can achieve by repairing glycocalyx, we did the similar measurements in young mice and old mice taking a glycocalyx supplement for about 8 weeks. And this illustrates that now the breakdown of your glycocalyx in aging can be reversed by taking a supplement. So there is a way to normalize your glycocalyx dimensions even with aging.
Yeah, this is interesting because this was the first study we ever did, 11, 12 years ago that, we had a hypothesis that we could do this, but this was the first time
Yeah.
that we got evidence that we were on the right track.
And it also shows us the potential of targeting your glycocalyx in preventing that increased vascular stiffness that we also see in kidney patients. But I'll show you that on the next
Yeah, and
slide.
the interesting thing with the mice model is, because we sacrifice the mice, we can actually measure things that we can't measure because we can measure what's really happening in the organs and in the tissue,
Yep.
everything.
And I'll show some of those data in a few seconds. So again, together with that loss of glycocalyx dimension, we see increases in PBR as we can measure with the glycocheck device. Again, confirming that that those increases in PBR that we generally measure with the glycocheck really correlate with loss of glycocalyx measured with a variety of different techniques. The next slide, it shows the impact of that breakdown of glycocalyx with aging on vascular stiffness. So on the top left is a measure of vascular stiffness used what's called the pulse wave velocity method. And again, it illustrates that with aging, your blood vessels become much stiffer. Again, what was very good to see is that if you give aging mice a glycocalyx supplement to repair glycocalyx, that also reduces significantly that vascular stiffness that's associated with aging. Well, why become these vessels stiff? And how is glycocalyx related? Now, we don't know all the details, but what we do see happening, if your glycocalyx is damaged, then also with aging, you see a loss of your elastin molecules in the wall of these larger vessels. And elastin, makes your vessels more elastic, more flexible. So if you lose elastin, then that contributes to the more stiffer vessels. And also that loss of elastin is prevented when you return your glycocalyx dimension back to normal with a glycocalyx supplement. Together with a loss of elastin, you see there's an increase of collagen, and that's another molecule that makes your vessels more stiff. So with aging and breaking of your glycocalyx, there's an increase in collagen, again, which is reduced when you repair your glycocalyx with a glycocalyx supplement. So, I just want to show this that increased vascular stiffness, that aging or the accelerated aging of your large vessels is very closely related to breakdown of your glycocalyx, which happens in kidney patients, and which these early data, experimental data, suggest that therapeutics repairing your glycocalyx might also mitigate that increased vascular stiffness.
Yeah, so these studies we did 11, 12 years ago were foundational to bring us to where we're at today, clearly.
Just for completeness, this is all large vessels. Also, the middle panel shows that aging, so the blue dots are the older mice, also have significantly reduced numbers of small blood vessels. So this is capillary diameter vessels. You lose more than 50% of your small capillaries compared to older mice taking the supplement. So the supplement brings back your capillary density to similar levels as the young mice on the left. So the gray are the young mice, and the green are old mice taking a glycalyx supplement. So in addition to reducing vascular stiffness with the supplement, also you can increase your capillary density. Well, going back again to the experiments that we did with the atomic force microscope, similarly as by using the blood samples from a kidney patient, you get very similar levels of glycocalyx breakdown by looking at patients with sepsis. So they are very similar in their inflammatory profile. So you're taking a blood sample from a sepsis patient, similar as for a kidney patient, you have significant loss of your glycocalyx dimension compared to taking a blood sample from a healthy person without kidney disease or without sepsis. Now, what's interesting, what you already alluded to for this study, is not only we took blood samples from these individual patients and they used it for the atomic force microscope on cultured cells to see how toxic is that blood sample, how much breakdown of your glycocalyx, which you can really quantify with the atomic force microscope. But at the same time, we use the glycocheck system in these patients that we took blood samples from to measure sublingually what their level of glycocalyx damage is by measuring their PBR values. And then we could actually compare per patient their PBR values with the loss of glycocalyx dimension as measured with the atomic force microscope.
What's interesting about that is, and I think the study we published was, with the same group, they were able to predict accurately, even when patients came into the ER who had a high likelihood of going into full-blown septic shock.
Well, there's the same group, and on the right-hand side, it clearly shows that on the vertical axis is that percentage of breakdown of your glycocalyx using the atomic microscope, and comparing the different blood samples from healthy controls and kidney patients or sepsis patients, and you see the patients that had the biggest loss of glycocalyx dimension were also the same patients with the highest values for their PBR parameter. But the PBR parameter, as measured by the glycocheck, tells you how much damage you have to your glycocalyx. And there's a very strong correlation between breakdown of glycocalyx in vitro with AFM from the blood samples, and then systemically measured sublingually with the glycocheck device. And it also illustrates that the healthy individuals had PBR values of about 2.0, just 1.9, 2.0, 2.1. But as soon as your PBR values get in, let's say, the 2.5 to 3.0 range, well, you're at a very high risk level of getting a lot of glycocalyx damage and significant systemic complications.
It's interesting as you're showing this slide. I think back of a couple that came in to see me. It was about midway through the COVID time period, and I measured both of them with the glycocheck, and they knew the husband had a lot of inflammation based on other things that he had. But when I tested him, I think he was like a 2.8, if I recall, on his PBR score as part of his microvascular health score. And so, I asked him if he had had COVID, and he said, yeah, I've had it twice. And I said, I am really concerned for you, because in the studies that we've done, that score tells me that you are at a very high risk rate of having something serious happen to you. And they go, oh no, this is how I always am. And so they left, and they took a couple of bottles of the supplement. But the shocking thing is the wife texted me literally within the week and told me that her husband was in the ICU, that he had been incubated, and that and then he actually passed away from complications of sepsis. So, already a week before, just like that study when we were doing it with the group in Germany, we predicted he was at super high risk to have an adverse event happen.
Yeah, again, illustrating, and even for you and I who do so many measurements and we see so many people, you really have to take those high PBR values very serious. If that's consistent, if that's real, if they're really at that high level, like 2.8 up to 3, those individuals are at high risk. And that's not the first time that we have such an experience, that serious consequences will follow shortly if you have such high PBR values.
Yeah.
Well, again, to illustrate that fact, if your PBR value is so high, also your microvascular score will be very low. And this just illustrates those people with very low microvascular scores, they have a very high risk of all kinds of cardiovascular complications and organ failure. So this is just showing that the number of organs in your body that start failing, like a heart attack or a stroke, or your lungs will start failing, is strongly correlating with that loss of glycocalyx and your decreased microvascular score. And then,
now, I just might point out that this particular study that we did here, again, this was done with patients in Germany. And And so, you can see where the healthy controls were, and they range from what, 3.5 up to 9.7 or so, or excuse me, 8.7.
Yes.
And so then you go to the little over 3 and then below 3. In this study, this showed the number of organ systems that were failing.
Yeah. So these people had value scores like 2 or less than 2, and so a very high risk of complications. And then to illustrate our other remarks, Bob, of taking those PBR values very seriously, so people that did develop sepsis, if they ended up in the ICU, but as long as their PBR values were relatively okay, so smaller than 2.3, so relatively small level of glycocalyx damage, this is a survival curve. They all survived their stay in the ICU, even if they had to stay there for a couple months. In contrast, if you have higher values of PBR, like the ones in the previous experiments, like 2.5 or up to 3.0, you have a very high risk of multiple organ failure and not surviving your stay in the ICU. You see, there's a steady decline in your chance of survival if you stay in the ICU with such a level of glycocalyx damage. So that might also explain the high cardiovascular risk in these kidney patients through breakdown of the glycocalyx by the toxins in the circulating blood and increasing the risk of inflammation and sepsis. That also contributes to all the risks that these kidney patients are being exposed to.
And so, that's why I tell people, the people have glycocheck patients as they measure people. I tell them we need to get these people ideally at 2.0 or below, because that's going to increase their potential for longevity and lower the risk factors of all the complications with conditions and diseases that can happen. So, I think the glycocheck, based on all the experiments that we've done, and this is important for people to understand, is we've cross-checked the test results and the scores we get across multiple markers, and they all validate exactly what we find, whether it's toxins we find in the blood, we do different blood tests, we look at different disease markers, and every time the results that we get and show are validated in the experiments that we do.
I agree, Bob.
All right. Well, Hans, thank you very much today. I hope that our audience found this enlightening. So next week, you want to make sure you come on board because, okay, we've talked about kidney disease. We've talked about the risk factors, how devastating it is, and how it has a big impact on productivity and life expectancy and quality of life. And so next week, we want to share the information that we've been gathering through multiple studies we've been involved in as we've developed and improved our therapeutic options to improve people's health and hopefully stop this big curve that Hans showed you that's getting worse by the year. And hopefully we can be a big part in, I guess, making America great again, or making America healthy again by getting this message out to all the people that need our help, which is a lot. So thanks again, Hans, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Bob.
Thanks for listening to The Future of Vascular Health. Healthy vessels, healthy future. If you're ready to take charge of your health, it's time to check out Revasca. This powerful supplement is designed to protect your glycocalyx, the microscopic layer that keeps your blood vessels healthy and strong. Revasca can help support your heart health, improve circulation, and even reduce high blood pressure. It's also great for boosting brain function, keeping your kidneys healthy, and preventing vascular complications before they start. Think of it as a way to keep your body running smoothly so you can live longer, feel sharper, and stay active. Don't wait. Take the first step toward better health today. Visit glycocalyx.com to learn more about Revasca and how it can help you protect your future.